Here are some details about the one-hand swing that I use to illustrate how to form the basic golf swing. So you heard me talking about starting with the right hand, holding the wrong end of the club as if you're fencing with somebody who's down here. We're not going to hit the ground yet, and you're going to turn the shoulders like a lid on a cylinder. Now, one of the errors is that people turn it by dipping the left shoulder down. We're standing quite erect for this because the club's up in the air. Turn more or less horizontally with the shoulders. As you play golf and the club gets either shorter or the ball's on the ground, which is where it always is, you'll be tipped over more, which takes that wagon wheel I described and makes it more vertical, more like a Ferris wheel, less like a carousel. So turn the shoulders relatively horizontally and make sure with the right elbow that you don't end up with it pointing up at the sky. You won't be able to see the shaft above your head, but it'll be pointing over there to the right of the intended line of flight. And that's not correct. We want this shoulder, and it's really the shoulder we're adjusting, to be folded into a shape that sort of is reminiscent of losing at arm wrestling. They also, 100 years ago, talked about a waiter with a tray. So the palm is looking more upward, the elbow looking down, then the shoulder has to be trained to accept those shapes. It's not quite natural. As a consequence, the shaft will be more or less horizontal, like on a shelf behind your neck. And so this is the error we don't want, and this is the shape that we prefer. Now, with regard to the left arm, it's no good starting with a perfect symmetrical shape of your left arm looking like a mirror image of your right. We must turn what I call bias, the arm, so that the elbow's looking out and the hand is turned sufficiently to the right that you can't see the fingers. Now, that means that this shoulder is higher and your body is subtly tilted. It's also extended, and that's another big difference between the two arms. This arm must remain extended on the backswing, and in fact for all of the downswing until about here. Then after that it doesn't matter. So the bad news is that it's very easy to end up with this arm bending. It's easier to bend at the elbow than the wrist, and ending up with your palm facing your face like this. This is the most comfortable one. And then as you swing through, ending up with your arms straight out like this, which at that speed can be a little bit hazardous for your shoulder. So the opposite of what's natural, unfortunately, is what we want. You're going to keep the arm extended and only hinge at the wrist. And then as you swing through, once you pass about here, halfway through the follow through, allow the elbow and wrist to bend so the club's behind your neck with the right shoulder still lower than the left one. One of the great benefits of swinging this end of the club is that you can do it with one hand, and it is light enough that you can actually see how any of your extraneous movements are affecting the margin of that swing, the rim of that wheel. If it's sort of bulging around like an amoeba, you know, or a pie crust, then you know that you're not stable enough, and balance along with speed and flexibility are what we're developing. So you want to draw this beautiful circle, and the sound is an enormously valuable tool. When you first start making a whoosh, you may find that it is, one, not particularly loud, and if it's loud at all, it's only from here to about here on the way down. And what we want is for it to maximize as you get through the ball. That will indicate to you how to time the turning of the body, the pulling of the arms, and, very importantly, the straightening out of the wrists. When you combine those together, you'll get a sound that's much more pleasing, where it's whooshing there as you go through the imaginary ball. So use the sound. Now, when you get to gripping with both hands on the wrong end of the club and tipping over, to start to test whether you can do this in the context of golf, which is obviously where the ball's on the ground. One of the features that is important to look for is that the brushing of the grass in front of your face and not gouging in front of your right foot or missing, which unfortunately are the easy ones, is accomplished the distance from your feet that you had planned, because we have a whole bunch of articulations all dedicated to going in this direction, and if any of them sort of surreptitiously move into a new shape during a swing, then you'll notice that you're not coming down with the end of the club brushing the distance from your feet that you planned. That's an indicator of an error, because a golf club is only 3.5 inches long, and a 3/4 inch error in terms of where on the club face you hit the ball can be quite disastrous. So we don't need randomness here. And it all comes from getting your posture to be one established correctly, and 2, consistent. Your best basic policy is to remain in the shape that you would have when you're just standing normally. It doesn't have to be more military. There's a natural concavity to the lower back, and the shoulders are generally back and down. And you heard me say on the first video that we bring the arms together, but the upper arms are still touching the chest. Now, when we take this erect posture and take it to the ground, you're going to tip over. When you tip over, the club does go down, but it also comes toward you. And if it's a longer club, it stops earlier. We stop at the top of an imaginary golf ball. And if it's a shorter club, then we have to keep tipping for longer. And as a consequence, the club ends up nearer to your feet. Once you get to about the top of an imaginary ball, use your legs to drop down vertically, but watch out that you don't pop your head back again, which is a very natural but wrong way to do it. Your head and your tailbone both have to drop down sort of parallel to each other vertically. And then you've got the correct distance for that club on that slope of ground, which is another variable. And you want to watch that those elements of posture don't change enough that the club brushes in an inappropriate location. So there's a couple of details about the one-hand swing, which should now make it even more effective and beneficial. It certainly is physically more demanding to hold those shapes all through the swing. And so you are stretching, strengthening, familiarizing very important elements. So the link land, which was the term given for this strip of land that goes around the coast of Scotland and other parts of the UK, was turned to the use of golf. Narrow strip of land, and grazed and kept short by cattle and sheep, particularly sheep. And the linkland is in the British Isles. It's all around the coast of Scotland, particularly the eastern side of it, and a little bit in the southwest, in the Ayrshire area, Turnberry, Troon, those Prestwick, those kinds of places. Then the north and the east and the south of Ireland, and the south coast of England, and a little bit on the west coast here near Liverpool. Lots of links golf, and grazed by sheep and cattle. And perhaps apocryphally, they suggest that bunkers, which are these holes in the ground with sand, were built by the sheep because they gather in the hollows to get out of the wind and rain, stamp and nibble away at the grass, and eventually expose the sand. And that was such a significant obstacle in golf that it was preserved long after sheep and cattle weren't being used to graze the grass. And those bunkers, particularly the older ones on the older courses, have names after hundreds of years. There's the Spectacles, the Parson's Nose, Hell Bunker, the Road Bunker on the 17th at St Andrews there. These bunkers have been there forever. Often they have that stacked turf you see in the picture there, and they're so deep that they often have steps down into them, and there's really no chance of going toward the green or getting to the green. You might have to hit to another part of the bunker or even sideways or backwards to get out. And it was in the early part of the 20th century that a very famous golfer called Gene Sarazen, the Squire, he was so frustrated by trying to get out of these bunkers with a niblick, and I described this rut iron, this deep-faced niblick, as an example of what they now call a sand wedge or a wedge. And getting out was so difficult because with this sharp edge, if you hit into the sand, the ball would go a yard, and if you tried to avoid the sand, it would go over the green. And so he bought a half dozen of these and started putting solder on the bottom and shaping it with a file, and eventually came up with one that has, and still to this day, this sort of raised flange on the bottom, a built-up area. And the benefit was that he could hit into the sand and have the whole thing just sort of splash out, ball and club and sand, and not get stuck there. And to this day, that's how sand wedges are made. So he's the father of sand wedges. And the purpose of the bunkers is obviously as a hazard because they're part of the fun, of the challenge of playing golf. I remember seeing an interview with a wonderful man called Sean Connery, an actor, who was a very good golfer. And he was asked why did he think golf was so attractive, and his answers, two things that I remember. He thought that it was possible to play golf and think of nothing else. In other words, it was so absorbing that really anything else in your life that was inconvenient was pushed to the side, at least for the time that you're on the golf course. And the other thing being that it was revelatory of your personality and your focus and a whole bunch of things that we generally take a little pride in. It certainly does take some patience to learn to play golf well. So, Scott, by the way, Sean Connery. So, learning how to get around these obstacles is part of the great difficulty of golf. So, on the fairways, on these links courses, the grass looks like grass, and you don't even see these hazards, these bunkers, until you hit a golf ball and your caddy says you're in a bunker. And you get down there and you're in this hole in the ground with the steps, and you've got to go sideways. So hazards, part of golf and part of the attraction, I think. It's not easy. Golf clubs have numbers now, and the irons particularly, they go from the longest ones. Nowadays, the longest iron a golfer is likely to carry is a 4-iron. When I was a young man, I carried a 3, 2, and even a 1. And those long irons, which are very difficult to hit, have been replaced by that one I described in a previous video called the hybrid or rescue club. Really a mod version of a long-nosed wood from hundreds of years ago, but much more easy to hit. And then the numbers get higher, which is a little peculiar, as the club gets shorter and more angled and heavier. And in theory, going a predictable shorter distance that stops quickly. So it goes 7, 8, 9, and then it gets a little weird because of the wedges. You've got pitching wedge, which is a 10, sand wedge, maybe an 11, well, no, gap wedge, which is an 11. It's all, they've got new clubs now, the gap wedge and the lob wedge, and then sand wedge and then lob wedge. And this numbering of the clubs only really started about 100 years ago. Prior to that, for all the history of when irons were a thing, and that was only through the 19th century, they had names. And you've heard me talk about a niblick, and particularly this rut iron, which was a deep-faced niblick. A niblick is sort of a wedge, and then Gene Sarazen famously putting the material on the bottom, inventing the sand wedge. Well, then they had other wonderful names, like this one, which is a 5-iron called a mashie, and a mashie niblick fell between the two, something like an 8-iron. And then you had a mid-iron, a driving iron, a jigger, which was really a club that had a putter that had a little loft, so you could jump the ball over the fringe when you were close to the green but not on it. And then you had baffies, spoons, and drivers. These are the kinds of names that were given to the woods. Wonderful names. A cleek was an iron. I had a cleek when I was a boy that when I was teaching golf I would always have with me. I just liked to have it in my hand. And I was mortified when it split down the shaft when I was hitting it one time. I could hit the ball in any particular way I wanted with that wonderful old club. So names on golf clubs, fabulous.